So let's work one more example so we're very clear on global scope, function scope, and block scope. So I'm here in JS Fiddle, and I am going to declare a global variable called A. And I'm going to output the value of that A so we can see right away. Why don't I say global A is, global A is. Okay, so I have a global A, right? Global meaning it's visible to the entire JavaScript application that I'm building, right? It's right at the top level. And when I run this, I get what I expect, which is that the global A is 1. So there's our global scope. Now, if I create a function, and I have to name that function, I'm going to call it f. And inside my function, let me do this. Console.log in the function A, and we're going to output this again. Clear the console and run this code, and you can see the global A is 1. Of course, I haven't called my function, right? So now I need to call my function. There we go, right? So f refers to the function, and by putting the parentheses after it, I'm saying invoke this function. And if I run this, I get in the function A is 1 and the global A is 1. So inside the function, I have access to the variables that live outside the function. The context in which the function lives has stuff that's in scope, like the variable A, and those things that are in scope at the level of the function are available inside the function too. That's actually going to become somewhat important when we start talking about closures. But for now, we can see that A is available inside the function. Now, if I add a parameter to this function, and it's called A. Now I've named it. I could call this anything I want. Hello, Tilda. This is Tilda, the tiny dog. Hello, Tilda. What would you like? What would you like, my friend? Pardon my dog. Okay, buddy. I'm working here. If I were to pass a parameter into this function, and I happen to name that parameter A inside the function, we're going to see something different happen. Here we can see inside the function, A is now 11, right? A minute ago it was 1, now it's 11. And why is that? It's because I happen to name this variable, right, this parameter that's here inside the function, or this argument, I should say. It's a parameter here. It's an argument here. The argument A, it's just a name, right? I could have called it anything I want. In this case, I happen to call it A. That might be considered not a great choice in this particular case because it can lead to some confusion just for the person reading the code. But regardless, JavaScript's not confused at all. JavaScript says inside this function, A has this value. Outside this function, this thing called A is it's a different variable that happens to have the label A, right? So here's our function scope because we have this. Now, let's do block scope. If I were to say, let me just hard code an if statement here. I've just created a block with these curly braces, right? It's a statement that follows the if. And in that block, I could say, let B equals 2. And in here, console.log block scope B is, if I do this, let's clear the console and run this again, we can see that the block scope B is 2, which is just what we expect. But watch what happens if I add another log statement outside the block and I try to access B. Outside the block, B is, let's clear that, run that, and we get an error. So in this particular case, we're trying to access the variable B in a place where it literally doesn't exist, right? JavaScript is telling us when it says reference error, B is not defined. JavaScript is telling us, I have no idea what this B thing you're talking about is. And that's because defined inside the block, it doesn't exist. outside the block. So here we have global scope, function scope, and block scope all happening in this same little program. Generally speaking, what you're going to try and do is declare your variables with the smallest scope that they need. So, if I have a for loop that's going to run and I'm using a variable inside that for loop that I don't need anywhere else, use let as the way to declare that variable, because by containing the scope everywhere you can, it tends to make your programs more robust, more reliable. It eliminates a source of error that often happens when variable names collide because you've got too many things in the same scope. Now, I should point out that this reference error, B is not defined, that actually stops my program. Whatever lines you'll notice, let me clear the console and run this again. You'll notice that my global A line down here after the function call doesn't even run, because this is a fatal error, right? The system just stops dead and says, I don't know what B is, and it can't continue any further.